Tonight at 10, cooperate or perish, the grim warning to the nations of the world on the threat posed by climate change. As leaders gather in Egypt for the latest climate summit, the UN tells them that progress on limiting emissions and global warming is woefully inadequate.
We are on a highway to climate hell with our foot still on the accelerator.
The measures to combat climate change, which were agreed last year, have seen very little progress, despite more evidence of the devastation that's being caused.
Climate security goes hand in hand with energy security. Putin's abhorrent war in Ukraine and rising energy prices across the world are not a reason to go slow on climate change.
But there have been some positive developments here in Egypt. An agreement to discuss payments towards the impact climate change is already having.
Yes, we'll have the very latest on the first day's deliberations at the climate summit in Egypt. Good evening. The global climate summit, known as COP27, has started in Egypt with the darkest of warnings from the head of the United Nations. Antonio Guterres said that the world was on the highway to climate hell, with no sign of slowing down, and that humanity needed to cooperate or perish. He declared that the climate crisis was now the defining issue of our times. Well, last year's climate conference in Glasgow did actually agree a number of pledges on cutting emissions, on phasing down, as they say, the use of coal, on stopping deforestation, cutting levels of methane. But the UN says that progress on cutting emissions certainly has been woefully inadequate. The planet has already warmed by 1.1 degrees Celsius since pre-industrial times, and scientists have long insisted that going beyond a rise of 1.5 degrees would see catastrophic effects for people all over the world. Well, without urgent action, the world is now on track for a devastating 2.7 degree increase by the end of the century. That's according to the Climate Action Tracker website. Our climate editor, Justin Rowlatt, is at the summit in Egypt, and he sent this report.
You'll have noticed it has been wet, and there will be more severe rain this winter, the Environment Agency said today, as it tries to raise awareness of the risks of floods. And it warns climate change will bring more extreme weather our way. In the Egyptian desert, world leaders have been gathering to try and tackle the climate challenge, including the British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, arriving in Egypt for what are expected to be some of the most difficult discussions in the 3-decade history of these climate summits.
Global temperatures keep rising, and our planet is fast approaching tipping points that will make climate chaos irreversible. We are on a highway to climate hell with our foot still on the accelerator.
Mr. Sunak said acting on climate also makes economic sense.
Putin's abhorrent war in Ukraine and rising energy prices across the world are not a reason to go slow on climate change. They are a reason to act faster.
But developing nations say they need the rich world to deliver on its promises of finance.
This backdrop, the lengthy discussions at COPs, with its stalling, delaying tactics and procrastination that have hampered implementation and delivery, is simply cruel and unjust.
It has been a year of climate-related disasters around the world. Dry weather in the North African country of Mauritania led to extensive fires last month. At the Glasgow Climate Conference last year, countries agreed to raise their carbon-cutting ambitions every year. But just 29 out of 193 have done so, and only one of them, Australia, significantly raised its game. So where does that leave us? So take a look at this. This is how much emissions have been growing. They've been increasing steadily. Now, the UN says we need to cut them almost in half by 2030, so in just 7 years' time. But this is the direction the world is currently going. Now, the UN says that puts us on track for a temperature rise of almost 3 degrees centigrade. It would be, it says, a catastrophe for humanity. For the first time in the history of these conferences, there is a dedicated youth zone, and the young people are frustrated.
Nothing new has been said. This is the 27th COP of its kind. It's older than I am.
We're not just here as symbols of the future. We're here as representatives of the climate crisis being lived through us. My hometown flooded in Mexico when I was 13 years old. That's why I'm a climate activist.
We keep having to pressure them, and that is why we are here as the young people, applying that pressure, and why we won't back down, because we believe that another world is possible, and it is possible to make those policy changes.
What do we want?
These young people worry their voice isn't being heard, however loud they are. But they hope that by being here at the conference, they will begin to influence the decisions that will shape all our futures. Justin Rolat, BBC News, Egypt.
Well, as we heard in Justin's report there, one of the key issues is compensating poorer countries. Among those is Pakistan, which suffered devastating floods earlier this year. More than 1,500 lives were lost, more than 2 million homes devastated, along with infrastructure, including roads and bridges. Around 30,000 hospitals and schools were also damaged or destroyed. The Pakistan government has put the overall cost of the floods at the equivalent of some $30 billion. Our South Asia correspondent, Rajini Vaidyanathan, reports now from the southwestern province of Balochistan.
The waters came, wrecking everything in their path. The classroom block at Orak Boys' School stood no chance. One small mercy is that no one was inside at the time. Rahan watched as his school turned to ruin.
I was standing on the hill when I saw the water and rocks gushing down. Our classroom was destroyed. We even lost our playground.
Claimed by a catastrophe, Pakistan's government says, is due to climate change. Another tale of devastation at the girls' school close by. And an early lesson in resilience. In these socially conservative districts, where many girls aren't allowed to attend school, it was already tough to get an education. Now they're learning in tents. 15-year-old Aisha is determined to become a doctor.
I missed my classroom. We had desks and we didn't have to sit on the floor. My dream is for my school to be rebuilt.
Brick by brick, recovery is slow. Abdul Qayyum collects the fragments of the home, which was in his family for a century.
My daughter is desperate to move back here. Day and night she asks for her bedroom. I'm scared to rebuild here in case it floods again.
This part of Balochistan doesn't get much rain, let alone flash floods. But this year they arrived with force, the water destroying not just homes and schools, but roads and bridges. An entire landscape redrawn. It could take a lot of time and money to rebuild. A monsoon on steroids, says the UN. This was the wettest August ever for these southern provinces. Pakistan's only responsible for a tiny fraction of global emissions. The country's Prime Minister told a meeting at COP27 that the West needs to compensate poorer nations like his.
Some countries, namely Pakistan, will be more exposed, more deeply vulnerable than others living in cooler longitudes. In my country, Sheikh Jan, millions of people are going into winter without the shelter or livelihood.
Millions remain homeless, already struggling through an economic crisis. A climate disaster has plunged them into further despair. The waters may have receded, but here they still feel stranded. Rajini Vaidyanathan, BBC News, Balochistan.
Well, in his address to the COP27 summit, the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, said it was morally and economically right to tackle climate change and to reduce energy dependency. His message was echoed by his predecessor, Boris Johnson, who's also attending COP27, who called on leaders not to weaken their commitment to net zero. That's the means of cutting greenhouse gas emissions to as close to zero as possible. Our political editor, Chris Mason, is travelling with the Prime Minister and sent this report.
This is what international diplomacy looks and sounds like, or at least what the Egyptian hosts want us to see and hear. Ceremony, serenity, smiles, handshakes.
Bring forward, bring forward.
Inside, in often cramped meeting rooms, it looks rather more like this. Here was the Prime Minister meeting the President of the European Commission this morning. After a room and flag change, it was the new Prime Minister of Italy next.
Right, brilliant. Thank you.
Pardon. And, oh, the camera's running, look energetic, President Emmanuel Macron of France. A chance to talk climate, but also try to sort other things out, like those risking their lives crossing the channel in small boats.
There is an opportunity for us to work closely, not just with the French, but with other countries as well. You will hear more details about that in the coming weeks as those conversations happen amongst all our teams. But I'm actually leaving this with renewed confidence and optimism that working together with our European partners, we can make a difference.
It's not the honest truth that your Home Secretary, the person you chose to appoint as Home Secretary just 6 days after she'd resigned from that post, has made the situation worse, made it worse at Manston, where plenty of people, according to some, have been held unlawfully.
Look, the Home Secretary is actually at the moment making sure that we reduce the numbers at Manston, and we're making very good progress on that.
Look who's also turned up, the Prime Minister before last. What on earth is he doing here?
I'm worried that because of what's happening in Ukraine, because of the pressure on fuel prices and what it, people are going soft on the idea of tackling climate change.
Are you backseat driving? There was no direct answer, but there was a speech.
Hey, slow down! Immediately! That's it! Game over!
I'm here as a foot soldier and spear carrier of the Conservative. I'm here in a purely supportive role.
Boris Johnson has said he is here in a purely supportive role. How would you describe it?
Oh, it's great that the former Prime Minister is here, and I think it says something. I think it says something great about the UK, that not only have we got the current Prime Minister here, we've got a former Prime Minister here. It just demonstrates our leadership on this issue globally.
As Chancellor during the pandemic, we got a sense of Rishi Sunak's priorities, but now he's on the world stage as a leader, and we wait to see what his instincts are as Prime Minister, particularly on foreign affairs. His challenge here, fulfilling expensive promises at a time of a squeeze at home. The new Prime Minister's flying home tonight, his dash to the Egyptian sand done. The colossal scale of his task just beginning. Chris Mason, BBC News in Sharm el-Sheikh.
Let's try and sum up what's been going on there today with our climate editor Justin Rowlatt, who joins us now in Sharm el-Sheikh. Mentioned earlier, Justin, some good news today. Tell us a little more about that.
Yes, let's focus on the good news. The positive development, I suppose the most positive one, was the decision to include loss and damage for the first time in these talks. Now, loss and damage is pretty much what it says on the tin. It's about the loss and damage climate change is currently causing. So developing countries, I should say, are often experience more extreme weather events associated with climate change. Think floods, storms, droughts, and they're often less able to cope with them. So they've been saying for a long time they would like the rich world to help them out with this loss and damage. Now, the rich world, which caused climate change, burning the fossil fuels that made it rich, has always pushed back on that. They're very anxious about signing up to what could be an open-ended commitment, particularly as the impacts of climate change get worse. The costs could run into hundreds of millions, trillions in the future. So they've always said they didn't want to do it, so it is significant to have it on the agenda. But, and this is a big but, what has actually been agreed is that there will be cooperation and facilitation talks towards a funding mechanism rather than compensation and liability. What on earth does that mean, Hugh? Well, what it means is they've actually agreed to talk about the possibility of future financing system rather than any hard cash. Now, by UN standards, that is progress, albeit actually quite small.
When we talked earlier, Justin, we did mention the fact that the UN head had talked of woefully inadequate progress since Glasgow on some measures. Do you think that COP27 will lead to a more positive outcome overall?
Well, listen, that is the agenda the Egyptians have. They're absolutely determined. They say this is going to be an implementation summit. What they mean by that is this is all about delivering on promises. We don't want more aspirations and pledges. They say we want delivery. But delivery is a much bigger challenge because essentially delivery means cash. Getting the development.
Well, I'm sorry, we seem to lose the link there to Justin in Sharm el-Sheikh, but thankfully, I think he'd made the principal points there about the hopes of the Egyptians of really building on the foundations that were laid in Glasgow last year in COP26. But of course, COP27 now a different story. If you want more details on what's been discussed at COP27 and what's happened since last year, what households and businesses can do to reduce climate emissions, well, have a look at this special section on the website, bbc.co.uk/news, and you'll see the various aspects there discussed for you.